So what is it all about? So it's really all about judgment. It's really all about God pouring out his judgments, mostly on the Roman Catholic Church. And that doesn't sound like a particularly positive subject, but the truth is that this is positive for a couple of reasons. One, it's an answer to prayers. It's positive because it's an answer to the prayers of the saints down through the ages. Those our brothers and sisters have been persecuted by the church down through the ages, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And it's also the section of history and prophecy that really leads us right up to that point when Christ returns back to the earth and starts, setting up God's kingdom on earth. So it's a pretty exciting section. And it brings us all our looking at history that we've done over the last week or so, right up to the present day. So we've got this image, and you'll notice as Rick read through it, these ideas of vials, which are really bowls for pouring out. And in this case, it's really just a symbol of pouring out of God's judgments on the earth. And the image really comes from the Old Testament, as all the symbols of Revelation do. So, if you don't understand the Old Testament, then you're not going to understand the book of Revelation. So particularly one of the quotes that uses this same symbology is from Ezekiel 7 verse 8, where God says, "Now will I shortly pour out my fury upon thee and accomplish my anger upon thee." So this idea of pouring out fury. And God's anger, his judgments upon thee, and I will judge thee according to thy ways and will recompense thee for all thine abominations. So these ideas of pouring out God's judgments, his anger and his wrath on the people that is judging. So they're all based in, as I said, all the symbols in Revelation based on the Old Testament. So you can see from, I've sort of summarised in one slide all the ideas about wrath and anger and judgment that run right through this section. So there's very much the theme of Revelation 15 to 18 is this ideas of God's anger, his wrath as it's translated in the King James Version, and his judgments and the iniquities, particularly of the church. So Revelation 15 verse 1, wrath of God. 15 verse 7, vials full of the wrath of God. 16 verse 1, pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. 16 verse 5, it's about God's judgment. Thou hast judged us. 16 verse 7, true and righteous are thy judgments. 18 verse 5, God's remembering the iniquities of Babylon and the woman. 18 verse 8, she will be burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. In 1 hour is thy judgment come, in 18 verse 10 and 18 verse 20, God hath avenged you on her. So lots of ideas about wrath and anger, God's anger and his judgment on the church here. So it's pretty clear that, given that strong theme, that's what's happening in this section of Revelation. So as, sort of really big picture stuff, and we're going to get into some of the detail tonight. I don't know how far into the detail we're going to get, but these first few slides really give you the big picture of what's happening in this section. So how does it fit into history and the future as well? Well, it really starts at the time of the French Revolution, so that's 1789. So, not quite, over 200 years ago. So it starts with that French Revolution and then ends really with the Battle of Armageddon and the destruction, the judgments on the Catholic Church particularly. Now, we're saying the Catholic Church particularly. Many of the Christian churches are sort of daughter churches to the Catholic Church, so this is on them as well. But, the Catholic Church claims to be the head church, the universal church, which is what Catholic means. So our comments are sort of focused around them this evening. So it ends with the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus' return back to the earth, and the setting up of God's kingdom, which will occur at that sort of same time. So the exciting thing, of course, is there's nothing much more left to be fulfilled, or nothing really left to be fulfilled as far as we can see in this section, before Christ comes back to the earth. And if we get to that level of detail, we'll see that when we get to chapter 16. But that's what makes this section really exciting. It's bringing it right up to our day. And the evidence of the prophecy is that there's nothing more to be fulfilled until Christ returns back to the earth. So we're talking about that period of history, 200 and what are we looking at, 230 odd years, between 1789 up till 2020 something, God willing. We don't know the day nor the hour, but hopefully it won't be too far away, as Rick prayed. So that's when this period finishes. So there's sixth vial, so there's 7 vials of judgment that get poured out in this section. And the 6th vial takes us right up until our day. So Revelation 16 verse 12 to 16 is that 6th vial, and then there's nothing really left to be fulfilled until at that point Christ returns back to the earth. So a lot of the history of this period, as I said, it starts with the French Revolution, and then during the French Revolution, a man named Napoleon came to power in France. And he did a lot of the work of these vials, as we'll see shortly. And he really became God's weapon against the Catholic Church and against the states that supported the Catholic Church particularly in the early 1800s. And there's a phenomenal amount of history that happens in the 25 years between 1789 and 1815, when Napoleon gets wiped out at the Battle of Waterloo. Amazing amount of history happens in that time, and it's really significant for this chapter, Revelation 16 particularly, that we're looking at. So as I said, the key image here, as we read through Revelation 16, is that of these vials, these bowls that get poured out. But the image starts back in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 5, and it talks there about one of the 4 beasts, one of the 4 living creatures. So it's not the bad beasts, the bad beasts of Revelation. It's one of the good living creatures, representing God and the saints. One of the 4 living creatures gave unto the 7 angels these 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God. So we've got that constant theme about God's wrath, his judgment, who liveth forever and ever. So Strong's tells us that these vials are really just these broad, shallow cups, and I've sort of depicted one from Greco-Roman times, possibly a fake, I don't know, of that time. And that's the sort of cup that these angels are pouring out in different parts of the earth, representing God pouring out his judgments on the earth. The 4 living beings, as we said, the 4 beasts are really the 4 living beings, and they're really the saints. And it's at their request. It's as the result of their prayers, the saints who have lived down through the ages, that these judgments are getting poured out on the Roman Catholic Church particularly. And then we've got the 7 angels who actually carry out the work of pouring out the vials. And of course, they're God's messengers who are, directing world events, as we, see in the book of Revelation and in the book of Daniel. So this really is sort of Revelation 15 verse 5 paints the picture of where we're at the beginning of this period. I just want to talk a little bit about why God hates the Catholic Church. It doesn't, and it's not, as I said, it's not just the Catholic Church, although I'm going to say Catholic Church lots of times. It's also the daughter churches and the other Christian denominations who misrepresent him. It's not really the fashionable, it's not really the coolest stance to take today, is it? It sounds pretty intolerant that there's particular people on earth that God really does not like. Aren't they fellow Christians? Hating is a really strong word to use. And I want to be clear, we don't hate people who belong to the Catholic Church, but we do hate the Catholic system and the institutions and the people who run it for their own gain, basically. So be clear that we're not hating on Catholic people who belong to the Catholic religion, the Catholic Church particularly, but it's definitely the institution that they belong to God does despise, and that's what this section is all about. So why does God hate the Roman Catholic Church? The key reason, I think, is because they claim to be his representatives on earth. So they claim to represent God, and And so when people of the earth look on the Catholic Church, they think that that is how God behaves, that they think that that represents how God is. And so the world gets a really distorted view of the God of the Bible. I think God really cares less about atheists, for example. They don't make any claim about God apart from to claim that he doesn't exist. But the Roman Catholic Church and the other churches claim to represent God, represent his beliefs, represent his morals on earth. And they do a really bad job of it, and God really hates that they do that. So we've got a quote here from Pope Pius X: "The Pope is not simply the representative of Jesus Christ." So they, take it a step further. They don't just say we represent Jesus Christ. On the contrary, he is Jesus Christ himself under the veil of the flesh. So that really leads us back to Paul's prophecies about the coming, degradation of the Christian church back in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3 and 4. That day is not going to come unless the rebellion first come and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And it's this claim that they represent God on earth that God really particularly hates, I think. So this rise of false Christianity prophesied by Paul in Thessalonians, the Catholic Church particularly fulfills it to a T, because they're the ones that claim to be, God's representative on earth. Jesus Christ himself, as Pope Pius here makes his claim earlier last century. So that's one reason that God hates the Catholic Church. Another reason, of course, is, or it sort of follows on from the last reason, that the Roman Catholic Church has done so much damage in the name of religion that logical people, humanistic thinking people, but, logical people, reasonable people wind up despising religion. They despise religious people and the God that religious people worship, because that's what they see. This is the sort of thing that you can see in the headlines about the Catholic Church for the last 20 plus years. Has all been about this, abuse by their representatives. And so the Roman Catholic Church has done so much damage in the name of religion. And it's not just this, it's damaged down through the ages in terms of war and abuse of people generally. So they claim specifically to be God's Christ's representatives on earth. So when people look at the church, they think that they are looking at Christianity. They think they are looking at the followers of God. And all they see is, things like child molesters, basically. So that's another reason I think that God hates the Roman Catholic Church and is going to pour out these judgments on them, and has started that a couple of hundred years ago and is continuing to do it. Then, of course, we have, the fact that they have persecuted any opposition, but particularly the true followers of God for the last, 1,500 or so years. So in their sort of attempts to cling to temporal and political power and money, of course, it all comes down to money, as we'll see a bit later. The church has, dealt terribly with people, very cruelly, and really disposed of and obliterated people who opposed them and who stood up for the truth, of the Bible down through the years. So we've got, a picture on there from the Spanish Inquisition, and there's, much worse pictures that you could pick up from that period of time and going forward. They've been doing it for, as I said, almost 1,500 years. And finally, of course, there is the fact that they have kept people in ignorance. So by claiming to be God's representatives on earth, they have also, on the other side, prevented people from actually finding out about the truth about God. So nominally, they're the custodians of God's word. They claim to be Christian. They claim to be the custodians of God's word. But then, of course, they forbade anyone from reading it. So the Bible translation, any Bible translation that wasn't in Latin has been on the list of banned books, which was banned books by the Roman Catholic Church, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. And that existed up until 1966, which probably seemed a long time to you guys, but it's not that long ago. that they banned any translations of books that were in people's, the language that people could actually read, and would only approve certain Latin translations of the Bible. So they prevented people from finding out the truth about God. They misrepresent God, as we've seen, but also stop people from actually finding out what God is really like by preventing them from reading the Bible. So we'd probably treat Catholics generally a little bit more gently than perhaps Dr. Thomas does in his writings in Eureka. But of course, he was much closer to the period when men and women were also physically persecuted by the church than we are. And God's not going to be treating them very gently, as we'll see as we go through this evening. One other thing, of course, we haven't really read that the idea about the Roman Catholic Church and its link to Babylon. And we're not really going to look at that this evening too much, but you'll notice even in chapter 16, Revelation calls the church Babylon. And it's really because Babylon, the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, is the direct descendant of that head of gold that you might be familiar with from Daniel chapter 2. So they're the inheritor, and I think you've done a night on the kingdom of men versus the kingdom of God. They're the inheritor of this title of the king of the kingdom of men, which has always stood up in opposition to the kingdom of God. So why does the Bible call it Babylon? Why does Revelation call it Babylon? And it does it in chapter 16 and then through to chapter 17 and chapter 18 if it's actually about Rome or the Roman Catholic Church. So clearly it's not literal Babylon because that fell well before the book of Revelation was written and really ceased to exist at all in about 150 BC. And it was never rebuilt on its original site at least. So it's not literal Babylon that is talking about in this, as you know, all of Revelation is not literal. It's all symbolic, and the name Babylon is no different. But because, of course, Rome and its church is the inheritor of that title, as we said, of the king of the kingdom of men from Babylon, from Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. So that's why it's called Babylon in this section of Revelation. Can we be sure that it's all about the Roman Catholic Church? So we need to, make sure that we know that it is all about the Roman Catholic Church. So we're just going to run through some of the links between what is portrayed for us in these chapters of Revelation and show that it's, it really is clearly symbolic about the Catholic Church particularly. So we've got in chapter 15 and verse 2, which is where our section starts, we've got this idea about the victory over the beast. So, you've been looking at some of the beasts of Revelation, which were symbols of the political entities that oppose God, the kingdoms of men that stood up against God down through history. And in this case, it's really a symbol of the political entity that the church had become, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire. And really religion had no longer become about a relationship between us as individuals with God and with our Lord Jesus Christ. Now it's all about empire, hence the term Holy Roman Empire. It's all about land, and particularly it's about power and money. So this beast that's talked about in chapter 15 verse 2 is the Holy Roman Empire that lasted up until Napoleon smashed it, as we'll see a bit later. And then, of course, that sort of became Europe generally. So this beast is about Rome and its descendant church, which is the Roman Catholic Church. Still got Rome in the name, still pretty Roman by nature. The headquarters are still in Rome in Vatican City. So it's clearly part of that whole system. So in chapter 16, verse 6 that we read, this gives us another clue about who these judgments are getting poured out against. It's against those that shed the blood of saints and the prophets. So it's clearly someone who's been persecuting saints and persecuting prophets down through the ages. And of course, that has been the Roman Catholic Church for the last 1,500 years or so, as we said. In 16 verse 9, it talks about them blaspheming God's name and not repenting. Now, the fact that they can blaspheme God's name means they know something about God's name. And the fact that they're not repenting implies that they must have some knowledge about God as well. They're not changing their teachings, even though they probably should know better. So it implies people with a knowledge of God, but with erroneous teachings about him. And, the Catholic Church fits that bill perfectly. Chapter 16, verse 13 talks about the dragon. And so that takes us back to earlier parts of Revelation, where the dragon who was about to kill the woman who was giving birth to the son. So it's got some relationship to the old Roman, the old pagan empire from back in Revelation chapter 12. We've got the false prophet mentioned in chapter 16, verse 13. And again, that comes back to that quote we looked at earlier in 2 Thessalonians 2. The man who sits claiming to be God and speaking on behalf of God, clearly a false prophet there, and again, clearly linked to the Roman Catholic Church. Chapter 16, verse 19, it's based in a great city. So it talks about Great Babylon. So it's a powerful city represented here. And of course, as we saw just in a previous slide, Rome is the inheritor of Babylon's title. What other clues do we have that it is talking about Rome and the Roman Catholic Church? So chapter 17, verse 4 goes on to talk about being dressed in purple and scarlet. So it talks about this woman, this whore, this prostitute, who's represents the church as well. And in verse 4, it talks about her being arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with jewels and gold. So purple and scarlet are the colours that the Roman Catholic cardinals wear. So sort of a bit of a link there as well. Again, we've got this connection with Babylon in chapter 17, verse 5. On her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great. So once again, this connection with Babylon, the head of the kingdom of men, rebellion against God, dating back to Isaiah 14 when, Lucifer puffs himself up and says, I can stand against God. Now that same connection comes through in chapter 18 as well, chapter 18, verse 2 and 18, verse 10 as well. Chapter 17, verse 6 talks about, again, a power that kills the saints and the witnesses. So again, a persecuting church. Chapter 17, verse 9 talks about a city that was built on 7 hills. So verse 9 says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads, which are 7 heads of the beast, are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. So the woman's sitting on a city that's built on 7 mountains or 7 hills. And Rome is famous for having been built on 7 hills. It's one of its defining legendary characteristics. Chapter 17, verse 15, it rules over a heap of different nations. So, the Roman Catholic Church has been in the Holy Roman Empire form, an actual empire, but also spread now as a church all over the earth and across national boundaries as well. The woman in verse 18, and this is really a key verse, I think, Revelation 17, verse 18, as to working out who it is. The woman that you saw is the great city that has dominions over the kings of the earth. So when these words were spoken to John in Revelation originally, there was only one great city that had dominion over the kings of the earth, and that was Rome. So again, we've got the Roman Catholic Church, Rome in its name, the inheritor of Rome's power in a religious sense, and still based in Rome. So if there's any, there can't be too much clearer quotes than that verse 18 to prove who this judgments are getting poured out against. Chapter 18, verse 2, again, we've got reference to Babylon, and in verse 10, there's that warning in chapter 18, verse 4, for my people, as in the saints, the followers of Christ, the true Christians, to come out of the Roman Catholic Church and don't be, part of, sort of an ecumenical movement, as it were. So don't join in with the church. So that's a warning, which wouldn't be tempting for people who believed in the God of the Bible. So it's a warning for us and Christians generally. Chapter 18, verse 11, and this section in chapter 18 is classic, I reckon, because it really exposes the motivation of the church system, and reveals it for what it's all about. So chapter 18, verse 11 talks about the merchants of the earth. So it's all about buying and selling. It's all about money. And that's what the church has become about. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her because no one buys their cargo anymore. It's gold and silver and jewels in verse 12, pearls and fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, scented wood, ivory, costly wood, bronze and marble. And then it goes right through this list down to the end of verse 13, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves, that is, the souls of men. So this really exposes the true motivation of the church, and another reason for God to hate it, and for us really to hate this system as well. It's about the souls of men. It's power over people, keeping them in slavery of ignorance and under the complete control of the church through that ignorance down through 1500, 1700 years. That's been their modus operandi for that long. So that's what it's all about. And this section in chapter 18 really reveals it. It's about money and it's about power over people. And that's really been the history of the church. Again, in verse 20, it's a persecutor of believers down through the centuries, also verse 24. And it's a city of the arts as well. So we've been to Rome, we've visited the Vatican, been through the Sistine Chapel, we've got a picture of there. Amazing artworks, priceless artworks. But another clear sign that that's what this section of Revelation is talking about. So I think we can be pretty sure that this is all about the church, Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church system, and her daughter churches as well, the churches that originally broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, but so many of them have gone back sort of to become part of the fold of the church again. And of course, this is why the Roman Catholic Church has been so keen to come up with different interpretations and timings of the book of Revelation, because they want to deflect this attention that goes for 4 solid chapters of Revelation against them. They want to deflect that attention away from themselves. It's so obvious to anyone who reads it that this is all about God's judgments against the church, that they suddenly had to come up, well, not suddenly, they've spent hundreds of years doing it, coming up with the alternative interpretations of Revelation and applications of these prophecies. So hence you'll hear about the preterist view that it all took place, sort of back in AD 70, or the futurist view that it's all still to come. And it will happen just before Jesus comes back. So that's all about the church trying to deflect attention away from themselves, because anyone who reads through this section, it's clearly talking about particularly the Roman Catholic Church. So that's sort of the overview of what happens here. The church gets judged. It's pretty simple, but 4 chapters of detail about this. So what can we say about the history that's already happened and the history that's going to be happening? So a very simple timeline for these 7 vials, so these 7 shallow bowls that are going to get poured out of God's judgment and God's anger against the church. So here's a really simple diagram to represent the timeline for the first 5 vials. So it starts with, as I said, the French Revolution back in sort of 1789, which went for about 5 years. And that was the first judgment. So it starts in France because France was such an important country as far as the church was concerned back in the 1700s. The first daughter of the church, I think it was, or first son of the church, I think they were called for a long time. And as soon as that French aristocracy was overthrown by the French Revolution and the church was overthrown as well, then these ideas spread pretty quickly. The Vial 2 poured out against the sea, so Catholic naval powers, not just France, but also Spain and Portugal as well, are curtailed in that sort of 10-year period of history, or 12-year period. Then we've got Napoleon conquering over in Italy, particularly where the Papal states were. So the Pope had his own land, as we'll see shortly, in Italy. had his own little empire, a couple of states there. And then Napoleon smashes the Holy Roman Empire, which is the beast, or one of the beasts of the Book of Revelation. And he puts an end to that empire that had been going for 1,000 years. And then the Catholic Church finally loses its papal states in entirety. So that takes about 75 years for that to happen. And that is all about the establishment of Italy as an actual country. So before that, it was sort of broken up into different, states, but it all came together by about 1870. And if we get there, if we have time to deal with it, that's when the Pope gets imprisoned in the Vatican, and he sort of becomes a prisoner in his own little city and gets locked up there until Mussolini releases him a few decades later. So that's a very simple timeline, but it sort of does outline it pretty well as to the sort of period of history that the first five vials are covering at least. So what happens, so now we're going to dive into this a little bit in a bit more detail. We'll just see how far we get, basically, because there's a fair bit of detail, a fair bit of history to cover. So what does Europe look like? So this is all dealing with sort of the European arena, pretty much, this section. What does it look like before the vials start? So in 1789, just before the French Revolution starts, Europe looks very Catholic, basically. It's either political supporters of the Pope and the Church generally, or actual dominated by the Church. So we've got the Papal states in an area of Italy which are actually ruled by the Pope, and then otherwise Europe is full of Catholic countries, basically, including Portugal and Spain to the west, but we've got France in the middle, and then right across to the border of Russia. So the exceptions really are England and the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire, which is sort of based from Turkey, owns all that area of Greece, and up through the Balkan Peninsula there, up through what would be Ukraine today on the west coast of the Black Sea. That's all Ottoman Empire. So that's all Muslim country there. So when we come to look at Napoleon's work, we can see that he sort of dominates all these Catholic countries, but when it comes to other countries like Russia, which is Russian Orthodox Church, not Catholic, when it comes to the Ottoman Empire, he wasn't so successful, and he wasn't successful against England either. So God was really using him as a tool, as a weapon against the Catholic Church. And as soon as he started to exceed his boundaries, then he got his power curtailed. So that's Europe in 1789, just before these vials start getting poured out. It's very Catholic, is the bottom line. Then by the time that most of the first five vials have happened in 1815, only 25 years later, the Catholic powers in the West, Portugal and Spain, have been invaded by Napoleon and very much diminished and curtailed by England's naval power. The church has been kicked out of France, so they've become a secular republic, so no more king and no more, well, for briefly at least, no more church. The Holy Roman Empire has gone entirely, so Napoleon put an end to that. The Papal states are gone entirely, or not quite entirely. They've definitely been dominated and conquered by Napoleon. They're not gone entirely. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is much diminished. So in the short space of only 25 years, when most of this history happens, Europe goes through a complete upheaval. And that's why, the French Revolution is described as one of these great earthquakes. Its effect on history was so incredible that it gets called one of those three great earthquakes in the Book of Revelation. And, the third one is going to be when Christ returns back to the earth and turns the entire world upside down. So you can see how, these other two earthquakes are pretty significant events. And the French Revolution being one of them shows how significant that is as an event in world history and Bible history. So the first vial, it's really the vials in chapter 16 that describe the detail of how this is all going to happen. So chapter 15 and chapter 17 and chapter 18 sort of outline the reasons why this is happening against the church, but it's the vials in chapter 16 that really give us the detail of how this actually happens. So how does it happen? Well, the first vial is on the earth, which is, and I'm not going to go through all the, we don't have time, obviously, to go through every symbol in this section and prove how we're going to link it to these periods of history. You'll sort of have to take my word for it to a certain degree for the time being. Happy to give you some notes on it, though, if you want them. So the French Revolution kicks off in 1789. And we've got, Louis the 14th, 16th, Louis the 16th. He gets executed, guillotine, very busy piece of machinery during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette's got her head on the ground there. She was the one that said, let them eat cake. So very dismissive of the poor in France. Began in 1789, and that's the year that the church lands. So we're particularly interested in what happens to the church through this period. The church lands get confiscated. And then all of Europe sort of says, oh, what's happening over there in France? They just, decapitated their king. We don't want that happening in our countries. We're going to form a confederacy to try and restore the status quo in France, which they were completely unsuccessful at doing. So Louis the 16th gets guillotined, 4 years into the revolution. And then Napoleon basically gets unleashed on Europe. So he was he was an artillery officer in the French Revolution, and then rose through the ranks really quickly during that French Revolution and became the general basically of all of France, and then an emperor. So that's the first vial. It's against the French. It starts with the French Revolution, and that a really important power for the church back then, and the church gets completely kicked out of France. So then we've got the second vial, which is on the sea, in chapter 16 and verse 3. And this is really talking about the Catholic maritime powers getting curtailed. So Nelson, who you might have heard of, famous admiral for England, defeats the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, amongst others. And then England was so dominant in the sea, across the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean, that it really acted as a buffer to stop Napoleon from expanding much outside of Catholic Europe. So again, God is curtailing Napoleon's activity and making sure he sticks with his job of smashing up Catholics effectively, to put it crudely. So the English naval power sort of dominates the sea and forces Napoleon to focus on Catholic Europe. And Spain and Portugal in the west were invaded by Napoleon pretty early on in his campaigns. So the Catholics in the west are getting dealt with by Napoleon fairly early on. The Catholics in anywhere naval related are getting dealt with by the English. The third one really probably mostly refers to Napoleon's first Italian campaign, which saw him defeat northern Italy and the Papal States. So he crosses the Alps, this really high mountain range across the northern end of Italy into Switzerland, and sweeps down into Italy and takes the sort of part of those Papal States areas. So that was a country that had been given, you've probably heard this history lately, but those Papal States were given originally to the Pope by Pepin, who's Charlemagne's father, and he'd rule over that period for the last 1,000 years or so. So this is the vial that gets poured out on the rivers, the fountains of waters. So that's the origins of the rivers of Europe is all up in this Alpine area, and that's where Napoleon has his first Italian campaign, and that went from 1796 to 1801. And we've got that pretty famous painting of Napoleon, which you might have seen off before, as he's just about to cross the Alps, looking all powerful and romantic. and he's about to take the Papal States away from the Pope. So that was a pretty amazing feat, to be honest. Crossing those Alps back in those days with no, mechanized infantry or anything like that, with horses and dragging cannons over there. It's pretty amazing, and he was completely successful. So he defeated the Austrian armies about 15 times in 15 different battles, and defeated the armies of the Italian states as well. And then finally signed a treaty in 1801 between France and Austria. So Austria is a pretty important power at this time because they're sort of the head of the Holy Roman Empire as well. And they come up in the fourth vial, which is poured out on the sun. So the sun, representing the ruling power of the day, is really representative of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. So the Holy Roman Empire that's started by Charlemagne in 800, and here we are, heading up 1,000 years later, and Napoleon's about to, completely wipe it off the map. So Emperor Francis II thought he was the emperor, but of course Napoleon basically smashed him, and that's what this vial is all about. Napoleon's defeat of the Holy Roman Empire, which was ruled from Austria. So in 18th of May, 1804, Napoleon is proclaimed an emperor. So an emperor is obviously one step above a king, someone who rules over more than one country, and he's crowned by Pope Pius VII with the crown of Charlemagne. So he, takes the crown of Charlemagne and takes that crown. So he, puts an end to this empire that Charlemagne had created. So that's the fourth vial poured out on the sun against the Holy Roman Empire itself. So you can see in that another pretty famous painting. I think it's in the Louvre Museum. Napoleon actually takes the crown out of the hand of the Pope's hands and crowns himself the emperor. So the Pope was there to crown him, but Napoleon says, "No, I'm more powerful than you are." So not acknowledging the religious power of the Pope at all, or any temporal power, any political power at all. He takes the crown out of it and he puts it on his own head, rather than be crowned by the Pope. So it's really a huge symbolic slap in the face to both the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire, who had always submitted, or pretty much always submitted, to being crowned by the Pope since Charlemagne's day. And that sort of marriage between the papacy, the Catholic Church, and the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon smashes right through all of that and says, "Nah, you're both gone as world powers." So that's pouring out the power, the vial on the sun. Then we have the fifth vial on the seat of the beast, and that's really coming back to these papal states that were in central Italy. So that's the church's own lands. They actually had, he ruled as a king over these papal states, the Pope did. And this work was begun by Napoleon, but wasn't really finished until Italy became a united country right through 1863 to 1870. And that's when the Pope became prisoner in Rome, when that all happened. So this period of time is all about the unification of Italy from different states into one country. So just as Australia was originally different colonies and became federated in 1900 into one country, that's what happened with Italy as well, but a few decades before. So they became united in one country. And it was this guy called Victor Emmanuel II who was really fundamental in doing that, uniting all these Italian states into one country. And he took Rome in 1870, and the Pope effectively became a prisoner in the Vatican. And it's at the same time, coincidentally, probably not, that the Pope declares himself to be infallible. So in 1870, when he's locked up in Rome, is when the Pope issued that papal bull There's his decree that says, oh, well, I might not have any power, but suddenly I'm infallible. So anything that I say from my seat in the Vatican is literally gospel truth. I'm infallible. I can't say anything wrong. So it's really presumptuous. And again, that symbolic of that idea that we saw from 2 Thessalonians, that he's speaking on behalf of God, that he can't, everything that he says is correct, which is, really presumptuous, and, further reason for God to hate him and the system that he stands for. So the Pope, once 1870 came around, had become completely without land. He didn't have any land to rule over. And then 1929 comes around, and Hitler's friend, Mussolini, who was, the fascist ruler of Italy, grants him the Vatican City. So you can see the church and the fascist states, the Nazis, basically, working hand in hand. And the Vatican City was given to the Catholic Church, given to the Pope in 1929 by Mussolini. So that's the fifth vial, the seed of the beast. And then, of course, we have the sixth vial, and this starts to bring us right up to our time. So this is not against the Catholic Church, not against Catholic Europe. So that's why we didn't include in that first slide about the first 5 vials. Now we're changing tack a little bit. So you'll see that there's nothing about judgment when he talks about in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 12. I'll just look it up, but there's nothing in there about judgment and God's anger. It's not about that in this case. So the sixth vial, the sixth angel in verse 12 pours out his vial on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, not as a punishment necessarily, but to prepare the way of the kings from the east. So this is about the shrinking. Remember, we talked very briefly about the Ottoman Empire. So it's the Muslim power that ruled pretty much from Turkey, from Constantinople. And they'd ruled over a fair chunk of Europe, as well as going east towards, Persia and Iran, and down to Saudi Arabia and across to Egypt and North Africa. So quite an empire. Well, God says, I want to shrink that empire down. And why does he want to do it? He wants to shrink it down so that to prepare the way of the kings of the east, to prepare the way for the Jews to return back to Israel, which happens in 1948. So the purpose of shrinking down this river Euphrates, which is, of course, sourced in Turkey, sourced in the Ottoman Empire. That's why it's used as a symbol of that empire. God says, I'm going to shrink this empire down to prepare this area for the Jews' return back to Israel. And that's really what this sixth vial is about. So it is really about the shrinking of this Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Turkish Empire, and prepares the way of the kings for the kings of the East. So it starts in, it started earlier than this, but World War I was probably the most significant period for the drying up of this Ottoman Empire. So the British in World War I did much of this work, pushing the Turks out of Europe, pushing them out of Egypt, although Napoleon had done a bit of that as well. But the British were the first ones to come up from the south, up through what is now the land of Israel, and to push the Turks out of that area and to prepare it under a British mandate for the Jews to return back to the land. So we're coming closer and closer to our time. Hopefully you can see. So this is all about World War I, which is 100 years ago, getting gradually closer to our time. So World War I, Britain pushes the Turks up out of what is Palestine back then and Israel now, and through Syria and all that. And they shrink right back to where they are now, which is, of course, a country of Turkey. It's not an empire anymore. It's just a country. So in 1948, the kings of the East that get referred to in Revelation 16, verse 12, the Jewish people return back to their own land. just after World War II. And then in 1967, the Jews take Jerusalem, which is an important part of that as well. So 20 years after they return back to their own land in their own country in 1948, 20 years later in 1967, they've also taken the all-important city of Jerusalem. So that's the first part of the sixth vial, the drying up of this River Euphrates, representing the Ottoman Empire shrinking down into the country of Turkey as we know it today. And then we've got these three unclean spirits like frogs that get mentioned as the second part of this vial. So frogs represent the country of France, and these really represent the ideas that came out of the French Revolution getting expressed by three different entities. They get expressed by so the mouth, it talks about coming from the mouth, so that's expression. It becomes policy of these particular things: the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. So the dragon really takes us back, as I said, to chapter 12 and verse 15 and 16, which was the base of the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantinople, that eastern leg of the Roman Empire, the eastern leg of the image of Daniel, and whatever country rules from Constantinople or in the east, so Russia possibly, and Turkey, it's coming from there. The beast really refers to the beast of the earth back in chapter 13, verse 11. And that scarlet-coloured beast that's in chapter 17 gets more description of it in chapter 17. So it's talking probably about Central Europe at the moment. And then we've got the false prophet, who's really only mentioned once in the Bible. So this is the only mention of this false prophet in chapter 19, verse 20. And then, it gets mentioned twice again in chapter 20 and verse 10. And it's really, I think, depiction of Rome being headed by the false prophet, the chief false prophet, which is the Pope himself. But this really brings it right up to our time, doesn't it? So, but we can expect to see, this some sort of unification between Europe, between Russia, and if they come down and take Turkey, and then also the false prophet between the Catholic Church from the Pope. Similar ideas, similar philosophies, similar doctrine, and perhaps that'll have to do with their sort of foreign policy. It might have to do with doctrine or policies generally as well. So humanistic teachings perhaps that came out of the French Revolution. But it's interesting to see the uniting of Russia with Europe and the Pope sort of leading that unification happening as well. So keep an eye out for that in your news feed and see what stuff you can pick up on that as you read through what's happening in world events today. And then finally, we have right up to our time in Revelation 16, we've got Christ's message directly to us. So can you see how he sort of interrupts the whole proclamation of all these different vials and judgments getting poured out? And in chapter 16 and verse 15, Christ puts these words himself into this section. He says, "Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." Or as the ESV says, that stays awake, keeping his garments, that he might not go about naked and be seen exposed. And then they assembled at that place in the Hebrew, which in the Hebrew is called Armageddon. And so we've got that launch of the Battle of Armageddon, which we think will be, start off with Russia invading Israel down through Egypt, as per Ezekiel 38. But right in there, right at the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, Jesus puts in a message for us directly, the people living in this time, because no one else, there's no one else for this message to apply to. So Jesus has written this particular verse directly for you and for me living in this time at the time of the sixth vial. And what does Jesus say to us? Us people living in the time of the fulfillment of the sixth vial. He says, "I wrote this for you, especially, and I want you to stay ready. I want you to know that I'm coming now, and that you need to be ready for me when I come. Stay ready. It's not a matter of sort of suddenly getting ready when I've arrived. You need to be prepared for my return, as it can be at any time. So I think that'll probably be enough for us. You can read through those next chapters of chapter 17 and chapter 18 and see, further reinforce God's hatred of that Roman Catholic system and why he's pouring out his judgments on it that we've read through in chapter 15 and 16.